Honored to have with us today Robert Bales, who is a CPA, ABV, and some other letters behind his name with Bales and Company. And he is a forensic CPA that works in the divorce industry, specifically on valuations and tracing in divorce cases. So we're super honored to have Robert with us today. So jumping right in, I mean, this is kind of your specialty, the valuation question. So we talked in the second section at the end of just kind of how you get to the valuation. Why is it important in a divorce? And so that's because in order for a divorce court to make a just and right division of the entire community estate, there has to be dollar figures on each of the assets. So if there's a corporation or a closely held business, or even stock in a not so closely held business, in the marital estate or in the community estate, there has to be a dollar figure put on that so that the judge can ultimately decide if a division of the community estate is a just and right division. So that's where you come in.
That's correct.
Because I can't value. I mean, I may figure kind of a rough number that I think it might be, but I can't go in and testify to that. So now, kind of laying the groundwork here. A client, an owner of a business, can testify to what they think is the value of the business, right?
Yeah.
So they can offer an opinion, and that opinion is valuable evidence. Can be considered.
If
valuable evidence, I don't know. It's evidence.
Well, sometimes it's not contradicted.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, it's enough. So.
But you still have to show, I think there was a recent case, we'll have to find that and post it in the group, but there was a recent case that talked about even if the client offers evidence of their opinion of value, there still has to be a basis
some support for it, yeah.
For that opinion. It can't just be, well, I think my business is worth $1 million. You have to have some basis for why you think that, or show some methodology to that approach. But assuming that your client doesn't have that basis of knowledge, then tell us basically what you do for a living.
Well, we attempt to come up with the value of these equity interests in these businesses. And in Texas, it's a little bit different than what you can sell the business for.
So the valuation for divorce purposes is not the same as a valuation for a sale.
Correct.
Yes. Why is that?
Very important, because personal goodwill is not a component of the value of the divorce value, or the component of the divorce value. Because the court cannot prevent a party from competing post-divorce, you value the business as if the party is free to compete with the business and not in the business. In most small businesses, this is a very, very, very large reduction in the value.
Yeah.
Not so much in a fast food franchise or car dealership or something where it's a little bit, it's known by the business name as opposed to the person. So that to start with, and that's probably the most important thing to know.
In the distinction between a sale,
right, because it's not uncommon for a spouse to say, I think I can sell my business for $15 million, and the other spouse hears it, and then they get a divorce.
Yeah. Well,
and then they come back.
$15 million?
Now it's $4 million. What happened? Well, the difference is he's going to stay with the business and make sure the customers stay with the business. Right. And he's probably going to have a contingent contract saying if they don't stay with the business, we're not going to pay you.
Right.
So that to begin with, and then with that in the background, you look at the assets of the business. How much are they worth? Are they all part of the operation of the business? Are there assets in there that have nothing to do with creating income, like a ski lodge in Colorado or a bass boat or something. And then how much income does the business make under this fictitious scenario of the owner not being around? And then you compare based upon the risk of that income stream, how much would someone pay to get that income stream versus how much could you liquidate those assets for? Normally, the higher of those two numbers is your value. Now, there's a lot of rigmarole that goes into getting there and determining what the capitalization rate is you apply. We already talked about what tax rate do you apply to the income, things of that nature. But once you determine what the income of the business is, you compute a value of the income. Another way to go that you don't see quite as much in small businesses is a market approach where you compare the sale of other businesses, similar businesses. It works if you're trying to figure out how much a business can sell for, but most actual transactions don't have the personal goodwill limitation built into them. And because of that, using, to me, some of the databases with actual sales can be a little bit dangerous with this personal goodwill aspect we're required to consider.
So tell everybody just kind of basically what is personal goodwill?
Personal goodwill is what the individual brings as far as relationships, skills, reputation to the business. And what would happen to the business, and whether it's in the form of sales or relationships with suppliers, what would happen with that person gone. So in most small businesses, you take that person out and there's nothing left.
Yeah.
One thing you have to look at is what we call the barrier to entry to the business. And if they don't have enough capital to start over again if they were to leave, then there's not as much personal goodwill, because it's less likely they would be able to step out. Or how long would it take them to reconstruct the business? I know we had one we did last year where it would have taken our guy 2 years to get the permits and to reconstruct a manufacturing facility. He was the engineer that designed it, but you got to go build it again.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so that diminished the amount of personal goodwill. Now, we still had some,
Right.
but his customers would have stayed with the old company
Right.
because they needed the product.
Right.
So you
'Cause they
got to
already
look
had
at
it
all
in
the different
place.
aspects of the business.
Yeah. So what's the opposite then of personal goodwill?
Well, I've had that as well. Negative personal goodwill.
Okay.
That the business is worth more without the owner. And I actually had one of those in a bankruptcy one time, and I was fortunate enough that my client had stepped out of the courtroom to use the restroom while I was explaining why I had applied this particular factor to the business. And I told the judge that I thought he was the worst businessman on the face of the earth, and it was worth more without him in it.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen often.
Yeah. Then there's also the component of goodwill that is valued in the valuation of the business. And what component is that?
Well, that's your entity goodwill, and that's the goodwill associated with the company name, with the workforce that's in place at the business, with its marketing program, its intellectual property, its web presence, all the infrastructure it has in place to make sales, to manufacture goods, whatever. That's the entity goodwill. And in the larger companies, most of the goodwill is entity goodwill because the sales responsibility is spread amongst a lot of people. The knowledge of the product is spread around a lot of people. So the larger the company, the more likely the enterprise or the entity goodwill is going to apply more than the personal goodwill.
So how do you go about figuring out is what the personal goodwill factor is in a business. I mean, what kinds of evidence would you be looking for us to gather, or would you be looking for?
Well, the first thing you need to know is what's the business worth, including the goodwill, including all the goodwill. Then you need to know what are the assets worth. If your assets less your debt is worth one number, I mean, that's kind of a lower end. The intangible assets are the delta, or the difference between that enterprise value and those asset values. And then you look very subjectively at what drives the difference. Is it driven by the workforce, or is it driven by this person? And you have to make a subjective call on it.
Yeah.
And anyone that tells you it's not a subjective call is lying to you.
So, and I guess that's kind of my question, is how do you get to this subjective personal goodwill? I've had, for example, times where we have done discovery on the client list, and then, maybe had my client, the business owner, contact those clients and say, are you my client because of me or because of the business, and kind of do a survey? I mean, is that helpful information?
Well, yes, we've done that as well. I don't think doing it with the client is that helpful, because they're going to lie to the client. But we've done blind surveys before, where I've had staff members who didn't identify that he gave permission to talk to them, do blind surveys to find out, why are you using this business? We weren't particularly asking, is it because of him or something else, but what do you like about the business? And we've done that in the past.
Yeah.
In most cases, it's pretty obvious. Hey, this guy does everything. All the sales come from his buddies that he plays golf with. Normally, it's pretty.
So maybe tracking lead sources. I mean, for a business owner to kind of track and help provide you information that would be valuable to determining this subjective number.
Yes.
Lead sources?
Well, yeah, we'll find out who are your top 10 customers. What's your relationship with each one of them? How long have you had them? What's your involvement day to day with each of those customers?
Right. Where'd you meet them?
Yeah, we'll ask those kind of questions. Another one is suppliers. People don't think about suppliers, but I did a valuation not long ago of a company that makes pine bark mulch, and one of the owners had a relationship with a sawmill that they got all their pine bark from, and but for that sawmill being available, they would be out of business.
So is that entity goodwill or personal goodwill?
That's personal goodwill.
To that one person, I guess.
To that, there were two owners, and one of the owners, without his relationship with the owner of that sawmill, they would have been out of business.
Yeah.
So you got to look at more than just the sales side.
Okay, so there's what, basically two approaches to valuation in a divorce context?
Yeah, the three would be income, market, and asset.
But market we don't really use.
Market is not as common. You do see people using it some. And I would just say look real hard at how they applied those factors and where they got their data.
Yeah. So then the difference between the asset and the income, when would you use an asset approach versus when would you use an income approach?
When the asset approach generates a larger value. Seriously, I mean, if you've got...
So asset's the floor, right?
Asset's the floor.
You can't argue lower than asset value.
Yeah, if you can go liquidate those assets and get X number of dollars, it's not going to be less than that.
Right.
But if the income stream's worth more than those asset values, then you would apply that.
Okay. All right. So what are some things you look for in coming up with that value?
Well, in a small business,
yes,
the primary thing we look for, other than just basic data, is how much personal stuff is run through the business. And it is almost every one of them, and it's almost always material. So That's very important. They're sometimes a little resistant to provide that information. But
And so you're saying that personal expenses that are not then counted as their income or their distribution.
I try to explain it to them as expenses a third party might not have to have were they to buy the business,
Yeah.
as opposed to tax fraud. So, but you try to identify that, and then the second thing in a small business is what's it going to cost you to replace this person? And we talked about that a little bit earlier. We're talking about
Right.
salaries and distributions.
Right.
But sometimes that's a difficult number because these people will need 2 or 3 people to replace them because they work 16 hours a day and do 3 jobs.
Yeah.
So you've got to define what they're doing, what it would cost to replace them. And with those things involved, determined, you can normally come up with a cash flow stream that you can put a capitalization rate on in value or multiplier.
Right. So what about like loans to shareholder? How do you handle those when you're evaluating a corporation?
Well, that's a great question because
Hi.
they show up
Yes.
all the time. And most loans to shareholders, quite frankly, are entries made by accountants to make the books balance. There's never was a loan made. There's never a check written. Most of them are not real loans. And quite frankly, I go back to the party and to say, is this ever going to get paid?
Yeah.
Is this ever going to be collected? And deal with it that way. If it's a legit loan, I treat it as a legit loan, but it needs to be shown on the inventory as a receivable from the corporation or the partnership.
Right.
So it needs to be consistent in the inventory. But if not, I just wipe it out and I let the attorneys know, or I'll put in my report, this has been eliminated and should be considered eliminated.
Yeah. What about retained earnings?
Well, retained earnings are really, it's an accounting term. That's just the difference between assets and liabilities.
Yeah. The cash
And
on hand.
It's gonna be part of the asset approach. Now, one thing when you mention cash, sometimes you have excess cash or not enough cash. So if the company's operating too lean or too rich, you may want you can adjust the value downward or upward if you do an income approach. The income approach assumes it's got enough assets to operate. So it's got receivable, it's got inventory, it's got some cash. But a lot of people hoard cash in their companies. And if they have excess cash, you need to add that on as
Especially
an additional.
when going through a divorce.
That happens.
And it's your job to identify
Yes,
that.
we have noticed sometimes the cash grows a little bit. And
But
you
to
add
al-
that excess cash in on top of the income approach.
But to
value.
allay fears, I mean, it's not like the cash goes anywhere. I mean, you
No.
see it and it's part of the value.
Correct. It's
Yeah.
part of the value of the company.
Okay. What about, I've heard of some lawyers that advise their clients to prepay taxes for future years to hide money within the business. Is that something that you can find and determine in valuation?
Theoretically, you can find it. I would not say you can always find it, but it does. I know prepaid expenses happen. Now, one thing we look at when we're analyzing a business is we'll take a look at the elements of their P&L and see where there's a big fluctuation. If we notice something's unusually large, we'll go drill down into it and ask about it. And sometimes that pops out, not always.
Yeah. So whenever you're doing an income valuation, there's sometimes are discounts. And so besides personal goodwill, what are some of the other discounts that reduce the value?
That's a very important question. When you're valuing a controlling interest in a business, it's not marketable. It's not a public company. You can't call your broker up and sell it tomorrow. So you put a marketability discount to take into consideration the time you have to expose it to the market, because you can't turn it into instant cash. The 100% interest in the business, those discounts are less. A fractional interest, 20, 30%, much greater. And then you deal with control, is if you're buying non-voting stock, a limited partner interest that doesn't have the ability to change the general partner, or something else that clearly cannot control, then on top of that, you take a discount for not being able to control the activities of the company.
Yeah.
That varies, and these are fairly subjective. There's ranges that we have empirical studies give us some ranges. With the control discount, the more money the company pays out, the less the discount. The less money it pays out, the more the discount.
The discount. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that just is a simplistic approach.
Makes sense.
So as attorneys, when we're reading a valuation report, what are some things, depending on which client we are representing or whatever, what are some things that we should be looking for in looking at a report that somebody like you drafts to decide or help us determine, is this a fair valuation, or are there places where I need to, question this expert witness about it?
Well, the discounts is a very important area. Take a look and see how did they apply them, how much were they. You probably are going to need a valuation expert of your own to run this by to see how reasonable that is. The biggest one is, what adjustments did they make to the income?
Right.
What replacement salary did they use? What did they assume the capital expenditures were going to be every year? So if you've got a company that's going to have to spend $500,000 a year to stay in business on new equipment, and they only used $50,000, then they substantially understated the value of the company. The capitalization rate, very important. Most of us use what's called a build-up rate, and it will have different elements of the rate, and you'll get down to a deal called specific company risk. You want to look to see, how do the two valuation experts compare on their cap rate. If one's at a 16 and one's at a 35,
That's a big difference.
there's a big difference.
Yeah, yeah.
So why the difference? And
Right.
that's where you need to go to your expert and go,
What's going
what's
on?
the deal? I mean, because
Yeah.
you're going to have differences. We're all, this is not an exact science, but that's an area where we see a lot of abuse. The replacement comp is a big one. I had one the other day, actually last week, where I had a very, very strong disagreement with the replacement comp used in this valuation, because they understated it by $150,000.
And that makes a big swing in the value.
Big swing in the value.
Yeah. So, one of the things that always bugs me, and I've done it at times, but is the concept of the two parties in the divorce agreeing on one joint valuation expert. Have you ever done that, Ryan?
I've seen it done.
Yeah. Well, we talk about things like that. And so, there's a lot of times where I would agree to do that if I have the company owner who's in control of the information, and it's an expert that I am familiar with their methodologies, where I know kind of generally how that's going to work. But as a general rule, I just don't really like using one joint valuation expert.
No, because exactly what Robert said is, reasonable minds could differ on a whole bunch of these things. And especially when you're talking about personal goodwill. It's a purely subjective number, and different experts are going to have different opinions.
And the
on
discounts
it.
being subjective and not really having the ability to hire your own expert to then challenge it, because then when you're in trial and they're parading this person around like you agreed to this person and now you're attacking them. So it seems to me that the better strategy is to have one expert perform the valuation for one side, and usually I assume that if I represent the business owner, that it's pretty much my job to put the dollar value on that asset. on the inventory. So the judge has that information. So if I represent the business owner, I pretty much think it's my job to go get the expert and get that valuation done. I'm in control of the evidence and the information. And then if I'm representing the non-business owner, I wait and get that report and then decide, do I need to attack it or am I happy with this value? And then, then I can decide if we need to spend the money on another expert to look at it and tell me what's going on.
I agree. I mean, and I will do a joint valuation. They are fraught with problems.
Yeah.
And never going to have a bunch of happy campers when you do one. But I find a lot of times, and maybe it's just because I've been around a while and people know me, I'll do a valuation, like you say, first. The other side will take a look at it, see if they agree with it. Now, they don't always agree with me.
Right.
Trust me, they
Right.
don't always
Sure.
agree with me. But I'll do it first, and if they think it's reasonable, then we just go with it.
Right.
And if they want to challenge it, great. But it keeps the cost down, but I'm still working for one party because inevitably questions come up about reimbursement claims,
Yep.
things that are a little bit more difficult to be in the middle of,
Right.
and it gets uncomfortable. So I prefer to be working for one side or the other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, a lot of times we'll do like the one side gets the valuation and then you go to mediation, and you can try to settle based on the one valuation. And even at mediation, you can kind of make some arguments about, well, now that valuation needs to come down a little bit because, this discount or that discount wasn't where it needed to be. But at least then you can get something and get to mediation. And then if that doesn't work and you're headed to trial, then you really need to get your own expert. Both sides really need to have their own expert if a company's involved.
And the one where I was disagreeing with the replacement comp was a joint expert who's a very close friend of
Yeah.
mine.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
just disagreed with him.
I mean, and joint experts create problems for payment. For you, it gets kind of muddy on how you're getting paid and making sure that,
Amen, sister.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just does. So you mentioned reimbursement claims. So let's talk about reimbursement claims. Like, what are some of the reimbursement claims that can affect, not necessarily the value, but kind of the division issues?
Reimbursement claims with companies, there's a little bit of statutory guidance. You have the time, toil, talent, Jensen that everyone loves to talk about.
Yeah.
No one ever tries a case with
Yeah.
it. And if you ask the judges, they basically just throw them out.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say
For
that.
the
but
most part, yeah.
Pretty much what.
Well, they're
some-
so hard to
some
prove. I
retired
mean,
judges have told me.
so to be clear, what we're talking about is where the business owner's compensation is not sufficient for the work they're performing.
Correct. And it's unless you have a very extreme set of circumstances, it's a difficult
It's
claim
hard to prove.
to prove. But probably the most common claims we see are separate property put into a community business, community property put into a separate business. You have to prove enhancement. One that is not quite as common, but we've done quite a bit of, is the use of community credit to benefit the separate property
estate.
company. And the case on point for that particular claim lays out exactly what you're supposed to do to prove it up. It's the Thomas case out of
Yeah.
Houston. And it's in the footnotes because the people didn't plead it. They said, we'd have given it to you if you'd pled it. Now, if you'd pled it and put
Yeah.
on this evidence,
Yeah.
we would have given you that claim.
Yeah.
But we've done that some. I know one we had that was, and again, it needs to be pretty obvious.
Right.
Where a company was about to go under, it was a chip maker. I think they made video boards back when video boards and computers were a hot item. And about to go under, and the guy went and guaranteed a line of credit. And without the line of credit, the company would have gone under. And so he exposed all the community assets when he signed that guarantee.
Yeah.
And because of that, the company ended up selling for like $20 million. And we were able to assert not 100%
Sure.
community, but maybe a quarter of the company might
Yeah.
be community because someone would have charged an equity piece to
Right.
sign that guarantee.
Right.
So that's a type of claim. Another claim that has been confused a bit by a recent court case is if you have a flow-through entity that the community pays tax on the income of and never gets any distributions.
So in that case, you're assuming the flow-through entity is separate.
Flow-through entity separate, makes a profit, doesn't pay any money out.
And so the profit passes through on the tax
profit
return.
passes through on the tax return. The community pays the tax bill. The money stays in the business and enhances its value.
Right.
So someone recently, with some very large money, had their claim or their reimbursement claim set aside,
Yeah.
saying you can't get a community reimbursement for a community obligation.
And that's that Dwyer case,
That
right?
Dyer case.
Dyer, yeah.
Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to argue with the court, but to me, it is an extreme injustice
Yeah.
that the community suffers because the separate property entity made
Right.
money it didn't pay out.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think the question there is, what's the proper way to plead that?
Right.
Probably reconstitution, but that needs to be pled in some form or fashion, I think. And
Yeah.
we see a lot of that in family businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Dad doesn't pay the money out.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
We're going to pay you a $2 million salary, but we're not going to pay any money out on this business.
Yeah. And then there's also usurping community opportunity.
Yes, you
And
do
that's
see
the Sprint
usurping the
case.
community opportunity where maybe the community could have participated in the deal, but he
Took it
chose
for the
the separate
separate.
entity to
Yeah.
do it.
So real quick, we got just maybe a minute or two, piercing the corporate veil. You mentioned that a little bit earlier.
Hard to do.
Well, and I actually won one. I've done it
Yeah.
once, and so that in our world, it's really reverse piercing, not exactly straight piercing. But so what you're trying to do is set aside the legal entity formality so that you can get to the assets of the company to divide in the community estate.
Correct.
And the most common way that you get that to happen is by the parties ignoring the formality of the entity and running personal expenses, treating it like their own personal bank account.
I think I had the other day that said, well, I don't have a personal bank account. That's the company account's my only account.
Yeah. So when we're advising clients and trying to avoid that, what Ryan said, I think, in the very beginning of our webinar was, making sure that they're kind of keeping their personal expenses separate. That's where he was headed with that comment is, am I going to be facing a claim for piercing the corporate veil?
And there's actually in the TBOC, they have a statute that's kind of addressed this issue, and the statute is now saying that you can pierce for actual fraud, but not for constructive fraud, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, all right. Anything to add on any of that? All right, then we are finished with section 3 of our Divorcing the Business Owner or Entrepreneur webinar. So the section 4, we will start in just a minute on post-divorce issues. There's a big thing going on right now with some post-divorce issues because of some of the tax law changes. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. We'll be right back. Keep in mind that this is a webinar that's aimed at attorneys. This is for continuing legal education. If you're out there watching this webinar and you're not an attorney, we welcome you to watch it. But remember that we are not giving you any specific legal advice. We cannot comment on any specific case or situation without knowing all the facts. So if you need legal advice, this webinar is not a substitute for legal advice. Please seek the advice of a lawyer as to your specific situation and get specific advice to that. Because if you rely on just what we're talking about here, we're being general, we're talking about general legal principles that may not actually apply to your situation. This is for continuing legal education only, and we cannot create an attorney-client relationship just through the video camera. Okay? Thanks.